You're in a bathroom stall at work, phone flashlight angled down, fully clothed, just checking. The meeting started 10 minutes ago. You've got a tampon in your bag, a spare pad just in case, ibuprofen, maybe a heating patch stuck to your stomach under your blazer. And you're still sitting here doing math. How long do I have? Can I make it to the next break? Did anyone notice? That's with everything modern medicine and Amazon Prime can throw at this. Now strip all of that away. No products, no plumbing, just a wad of cloth. You'll wash and reuse tomorrow. And the man writing the official medical literature of the time, a guy named Pliny the Elder, taken completely seriously for over 1,000 years, believes that just by walking past a beehive on a day like today, you could kill every single bee inside it. He wrote that down. As fact, in a book doctors actually consulted. Because, here's the thing, roughly half of all humans who have ever lived have menstruated, for about a week, every single month, for decades of their lives. That's not a niche topic, it's one of the most common physical experiences a human body goes through. And almost nobody has actually mapped out what people did about it, civilization by civilization. So that's what we're doing. We're going to Egypt, where women were using a version of a tampon, literally thousands of years before the patent existed. We're going to Rome, where the most respected naturalist of his generation genuinely believed period blood could rust iron and drive dogs insane. And we're going to find out exactly how that belief survived, completely unchallenged, for over 1,000 years. And we're going to talk about the giant, silent class divide that ran straight through this experience in every single era. Because if you were poor, this wasn't just inconvenient. In some periods of history, it was the difference between staying employed and not. Let's get into it. So let's get one thing straight right away. Managing a period is not a modern invention. We've been doing this since the very beginning. And weirdly, one of the earliest civilizations on record handled it with more practical competence than a lot of what came centuries later. We're starting in ancient Egypt, somewhere around 1500 BCE. There's a document called the Ebers Papyrus, basically an enormous ancient medical textbook. And buried inside it are some of the very first written references to women using softened papyrus and linen to manage their flow. Softened papyrus, the same plant they were writing on, repurposed and worked until it was soft enough to function almost exactly like an early pad, or rolled and used like a primitive tampon. Let that sink in. Several thousand years before a patent existed for anything like this, Egyptian women had already figured out the basic engineering. And it wasn't treated as some shameful secret either. The Egyptians connected menstruation to Hathor, a major goddess associated with fertility and protection. So on a spiritual level, this was framed as powerful, not dirty. There's even a record from a place called Deir el-Medina, a village built for the workers constructing royal tombs, where a man's absence from work was excused because his wife or daughter was menstruating. Whether that was empathy or something closer to ritual obligation, we genuinely don't know. But either way, it was considered a legitimate reason to not show up. There's also an even older document, the Kahun Papyrus, dating back to around 1800 BCE, one of the oldest medical texts on Earth, and it already treats menstrual irregularity as something worth diagnosing and treating, not something to just endure. Physicians prescribed specific plant-based remedies for period pain and heavy bleeding. This wasn't guesswork passed between neighbors. This was written down, studied medicine, practiced by professionals, 3,500 years ago. Now, was Egypt some kind of progressive utopia about this? No. There were still temple restrictions, still ideas about ritual impurity, still places a menstruating woman wasn't allowed to enter. But functionally, in terms of pure problem-solving, they were ahead of civilizations that came 1,000 years after them. And that's important to sit with for a second, because what happens next is a complete 180, and we're not even leaving for Europe yet to find it. Travel to India, and you'll find one of the strangest contradictions in this entire video sitting inside a single culture. In Assam, there's a temple called Kamakhya, dedicated to a goddess believed to menstruate once a year, during the monsoon season. When it happens, the temple physically closes its doors for 3 days. The water in a nearby spring runs red, and when the temple reopens, hundreds of thousands of pilgrims show up to celebrate, not to avoid the goddess, but to receive a piece of cloth, believed to have been soaked in her menstrual blood, because it's considered a blessing. This is not a fringe practice. This is one of the largest religious festivals in the region, happening every single year, built entirely around the idea that menstruation is sacred power, not contamination. Now travel a few hundred miles south, same country, same broad religious tradition, and you land at Sabarimala, a temple where, for centuries, women of menstruating age were physically barred from entering, on the basis that their presence would compromise the deity's purity. Same belief system, same country. One temple throws a festival because a goddess menstruates. Another temple bans women for the exact same biological reality. That ban only got overturned by India's Supreme Court in 2018, meaning this contradiction wasn't some ancient relic sealed in the past, it was still actively unresolved well into the modern era. So even within one place, one set of myths, you don't get a single consistent answer to, is this sacred or is this shameful? You get both, simultaneously, a few hundred miles apart, and that tension, sacred on one hand, forbidden on the other, is about to show up again, in an even more extreme form, once we cross over into Greece and Rome. You'd think the people who invented democracy and geometry would be the ones to finally get this right. They were not even close. Start with Aristotle. Genuinely one of the smartest humans to ever live, founder of half of Western science as we know it. He wrote, in complete seriousness, that a menstruating woman could dim the polished surface of a bronze mirror just by looking into it, and that the stain could only be removed by washing the mirror in running water. The father of logic, and that's the conclusion he landed on. But while the philosophers were busy theorizing, actual physicians were doing something far more useful. Greek and Roman doctors, including a Roman gynecologist named Soranus of Ephesus, whose writings were treated as the gold standard for centuries, were recommending wool, specifically softened, lint-like wool, used as an internal plug. That's not folklore. That's a documented medical recommendation, essentially describing a tampon, written down roughly 2,000 years before the version on your bathroom shelf. So even in the same culture, at the same time, you've got working medicine sitting right next to total nonsense. And the nonsense is about to get a lot louder. The real main event is a Roman named Pliny the Elder, and you need to understand, this man was not some fringe lunatic scribbling in a cave. He was a naval commander, a respected scholar, and the author of Natural History, which functioned for centuries as one of the most cited scientific reference texts in the ancient world. Doctors used this book. Educated men trusted this book. And in this book, Pliny sat down and wrote, with total confidence, that a menstruating woman has the power to do the following: sour a barrel of wine just by being near it, kill an entire colony of bees, dull a sharpened razor, rust solid iron and bronze, cloud a polished mirror, wither crops and fruit on the vine just by walking past them, drive a dog into a frothing, biting rage, and, this is the one that really gets me, scare off an actual whirlwind. A weather event. Pliny believed period blood could repel a storm. Here's the part that's genuinely funny, though. Sit with this for a second. If Pliny actually believed all of this, a menstruating woman in ancient Rome was basically walking around with the destructive power of a small natural disaster. And somehow nobody thought, hey, maybe we should be a little nicer to her. Nobody handed her the keys to anything. Nobody asked her to scare off a hurricane for the empire. She gets blamed for every dead bee and sour vat of wine in the neighborhood. But the second there's an actual emergency, suddenly the city forgets she's supposedly got apocalyptic powers. That's the real plot twist of this story. They wrote down that women could rust iron with a glance, and somehow still didn't give them the day off. And this isn't where it stops. This belief didn't stay contained to one weird book in one era. It spread forward for over 1,000 years. By the Middle Ages, physicians and folk belief alike held that if a man's body came into contact with menstrual blood, it could cause real physical harm to him. And if a child was conceived during a woman's period, that child was believed to come out deformed, or possessed, and this detail shows up again and again in medieval sources, born with red hair, which was treated as its own kind of bad omen. One naturalist's overconfident guesswork in the 1st century became unquestioned medical doctrine well into the 1500s. Now here's the part that proves this wasn't just a European problem, because on the completely opposite side of the planet, with zero contact between the two civilizations, ancient China landed on the exact same idea of menstrual blood as something dangerous and polluting, entirely on its own. Centuries later, the Ming dynasty's most famous physician, Li Shizhen, wrote an entire medical encyclopedia warning men to physically keep their distance from menstruating women, cautioning that contact could drain a man's vital energy. Same fear, different continent, no shared source material. But here's where it gets genuinely absurd. Chinese women used a reusable cloth pad called a yuejing dai, literally a moon cloth. And because menstrual blood was considered so deeply polluting, historical sources describe something remarkable. Getting hit with a used yuejing dai was considered one of the single most humiliating things that could happen to a man. Not a punch. Not an insult shouted in the street. Getting struck with someone's used period cloth was treated as a genuine act of ritual degradation, serious enough that sources bothered writing it down. Sit with that for a second. An entire civilization decided the worst thing you could throw at your enemy wasn't a rock, or an object, or even an insult. It was a piece of laundry, and somehow, this is treated as more shameful in the historical record than actual violence. Meanwhile, over in Japan, women were solving the exact same practical problem completely differently, using tightly rolled paper as an early tampon, centuries before paper products became standard anywhere else in the world. So even as two neighboring civilizations agreed the blood itself was something to fear, they landed on totally different, totally independent engineering solutions for managing it. The fear was universal. The workaround was always local. Now set the wine-souring, bee-killing theories aside for a second, because underneath all of that mythology was a much more grounded, much more human problem, actually managing a period, physically, day to day. And the way you solved that problem depended entirely on how much money you had. And that single fact runs through every era we've covered so far. If you were a wealthy woman in medieval or early modern Europe, you had dedicated linens, clean cloth, kept specifically for this purpose, washed promptly, replaced when worn out. If you weren't wealthy, you used whatever fabric scrap you could find, washed it when you had time and water to spare, and reused it until it fell apart. This is, genuinely, where the phrase, on the rag comes from. It's not slang invented for a joke, it's a literal description of the actual cloth women were using. But here's the detail that doesn't make it into the casual version of this story. Historians who've studied early modern Europe, women like Dr. Sarah Reed, have concluded that an enormous number of women, when they didn't have rags available or couldn't spare the time and water to wash them, simply bled directly into their clothing. Not occasionally, regularly. That was the actual lived alternative for a huge portion of the population, and it's barely written down anywhere, because almost nobody was recording the daily lives of poor women in the first place. It's worth pointing out this wasn't just a European pattern either. In traditional equatorial and West African communities, women used rolled grass and woven grass mats to absorb their flow, a separate, independently invented solution to the exact same problem, just using whatever raw material the land provided. Some communities also kept dedicated huts where menstruating women would rest, away from daily labor, echoing that same seclusion as care idea we just saw in India, rather than seclusion as shame. But the underlying class pressure followed the same shape it always does. Women with access to enough grass, enough cloth, enough time to prepare and wash it, managed. Women without any of that simply went without. Now fast forward to the Industrial Revolution, and the class gap doesn't close, it just changes shape. Picture a Victorian-era textile factory. Rows of women standing at machines for 10, 12 hours a shift. There are accounts of factory floors where women would lay down straw to catch whatever soaked through their layers, because stopping the line, leaving the floor, or taking a break simply was not an option. Wealthy Victorian women, meanwhile, had access to specially designed sanitary aprons and reusable cloth products, specifically made for this. Imperfect, but a real category of products that existed for people who could afford them. So this is the through line. It's never been just about whether you had a period. It's about whether you had the money to manage it with dignity, or whether you had to handle it in silence, in public, with whatever was on hand. And if that sounds uncomfortably familiar, it should, because we're about to land on exactly why. Here's a fact that tends to genuinely surprise people. The modern disposable sanitary pad wasn't even invented until the 1920s. The modern tampon with an applicator came along in 1929. For the overwhelming majority of human history, Egypt, Greece, Rome, the entire Middle Ages, most of the Industrial Revolution, there was no product. There was only cloth, cleverness, and whatever your circumstances allowed you to access. And that class divide we just walked through? It never actually closed. It just changed its name. Today it's called period poverty. And right now, in the country you're watching this in, there are people skipping school or missing work because they can't afford basic period products. The rag in medieval England and the empty shelf in a modern bathroom are separated by 800 years and basically nothing else. And maybe that's the real takeaway buried under all of Pliny's nonsense about wine and bees and whirlwinds. He was so busy inventing imaginary powers for menstruating women, powers nobody ever actually benefited from, that he never once stopped to ask the only question that mattered. Does she have what she needs to get through today? 2,000 years later, in a much richer, much more advanced world, that's still the question a lot of people are quietly asking themselves in a bathroom stall.